I'm going to go ahead and use the test credit card and confirm that I want to purchase that. Now that workflow will run. It will send me through to my order summary page here. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build an Uber Eats clone entirely out of no-code using Bubble. I've been using no-code tools over the past 2 years, and I can easily say that Bubble is my favorite and most powerful to leverage. I love that you not only have control over creating your own custom database, the front-end design, and the workflows that power it, but you can also integrate with third-party tools and services through their plugins or API connector. For those of you who don't know me, I've spent the past year working with the Bubble team to write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Airbnb, Uber, and Instagram, and explained the step-by-step process to rebuilding them within their tool. After receiving a ton of requests from the no-code community, I've decided to create my own separate video series that will walk you through these steps in more detail. Of course, I'd just like to point out that this series has no affiliation with Bubble at all, and it's something that I'm doing within my own time. Within today's tutorial, I'll be walking you through the process of creating your own Uber Eats clone. This will include features like registering user accounts, creating new restaurants that can list food items in our application, building out a homepage with a search function, creating dynamic restaurant pages to display listings and food items, creating a custom checkout that can also process payments, building out a dashboard where delivery drivers can accept new orders, creating a dynamic restaurant page to display the status of an order, and also a restaurant dashboard that allows restaurant owners to manage a list of incoming orders. This tutorial is quite jam-packed, so grab your Bubble editor and let's get started. The first module within this tutorial today isn't going to actually cover any core features within our build. Instead, we're going to take the time to set up and configure our database to just build out the necessary framework so we can easily build out the list of features that I also have listed for us here today. Now, for the sake of our tutorial today, I'm going to be keeping track of everything within our build, from the database setup through to the features that I'll be adding, all within a Notion doc here. What I love about Notion is that it allows me to just structure my build, and I do this with any Bubble application that I create. And that way, when I've added in a particular data type or even a feature, I can just check this off and keep a track of where I am within my build. If you don't have a Notion account, I definitely encourage you to create one. They're free to create and use, and it'll just help you keep track and structure your build. As I mentioned, throughout the first step in our build today, I'm just going to be taking the time to walk us through the necessary data types and field we need to add in order to properly structure our custom database. So let's jump over into our Bubble editor here, and I'm going to open up our data tab on the left-hand side here. And the first thing you'll notice is that by default, Bubble already adds a user data type into your application. And this is because you obviously will need to have user accounts in order for users to log in and use your app. Now, by default, this user data type will automatically include an email data field. It will also include a password data field, but that just won't be displayed in plain text for you to view. But before we go and add in our list of data fields and different data types, there is one thing I wanted to run you through first, and that is the privacy settings that Bubble adds by default into your Bubble application. So right next to our user data type here, you can see that there is a link that mentions that privacy rules have been applied to this data type. And now what this essentially means is that if we click into it, it will open up the list of privacy rules that Bubble has added. And within these rules, it essentially just means that only a user can see their own data that they've created within this application, which for the sake of our tutorial today isn't the experience I would like to create. Within our application, I want users to be able to see different information from those who have created their own restaurants, listed their own food items for sale, and then of course I'll be exchanging address information between those who are placing orders and those who are delivering those orders. So in this case, this privacy rule isn't relevant to our build today. So I'm going to head over to the trash can icon here and select to delete that. What I would also just like to note back in our data types tab here is you can now see that that user data type is publicly visible, which is what we want. I also just wanted to explain that when you're adding in a new data type, which I will be in a moment, you'll just need to double check that this box here, which makes the data type private by default, is not selected. Because if this is checked, it will then add the same privacy rule as before to the new data type as well. And what you'll see happen if you have any privacy rules applied to any of your data types when you're previewing your application is that the layout of the page will load accordingly to the way that you've designed it, but any data within elements like repeating groups or any dynamic text elements just won't display on the page, and it might almost seem like your application's broken or there's a bug within Bubble, but 99% of the time this is the cause of that problem. But now that I've ran you through the privacy rules and settings that Bubble automatically adds, we can take the time to now build out the custom structure of our own database. So I've got this listed within my Notion doc here, and you can see that there's a couple of different data types. There's our user, there's a restaurant, there's a food item, and then there is an order. What I would like to just note first though is I also have what's called an option set here, which allows us to store the value of food categories within our application. Now, if you're new to Bubble and you're unfamiliar with option sets, they essentially are similar to a data type within your database that allow you to actually just store a value without having to manually create it within the user interface while you're actually using your app. And then at any point throughout your app, you can just reference those predetermined values at any given time. And the reason I'll be using an option set to register our food categories today is because I'm going to have a couple different drop-down menus within our Uber Eats clone. And that would allow restaurant owners, for instance, to identify what category a new food item belongs to. Or it could also be used in the case where a user would like to filter search options for restaurants by the food categories that they have. And now instead of manually having to type out all of the food category options within every single drop-down on my application, I can just add this list to my option set. And then at any point throughout my app, I can reference this list within a drop-down menu, which just streamlines the entire process of setting them up. What I also love about option sets is because I've added them in once and then I'm calling upon that at any given time, I don't have to worry about any accidental typos that I might add within my different drop-downs. Because let's say if I had two separate drop-down menus and I had spelt burgers incorrectly in one of them, and then later on I'd like to reference the category for that food item, it might not actually display because it's spelt incorrectly. So option sets is just a safe way to also verify that the information you're storing for a food item in our case is accurate and true within our database. So we're going to jump over into our Bubble editor here, and we're going to start by adding in our option sets. And now the way you add these isn't within your data types heading here, it's underneath our option sets menu here. And what you'll find is that the process of creating an option set is very much the same as creating a data type. So it's not like you're going to have to learn a completely new experience. And I'm going to start by adding our first and only option set called food categories. I will create that. And now within our food categories, I can add a list of different choices to choose from. And the options I would like to begin adding is first of all burgers. I'll create that. Then there was sushi. And then there was also the option for Mexican. I will add those in. And now by default, the value of these option sets is just listed as a display, which means that because we're typing in some text here, as you can see, if I would like to call upon this option set at any given time, I just have to refer to the display text that we have saved. So the display text here would be burgers, sushi, and Mexican. You can, if you would like, also add different attributes, so things like images to each option, but I'm not going to worry about that today as I don't want to overcomplicate things within this build. But if we are to jump back into our Notion doc, I'm going to just check off that I've finished adding in my list of option sets. And now we can move on to adding in all of our different data types and then the data fields within them. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our data types tab here. Before we start adding in our data fields, I'm going to first add in our data types. And now the reason I do that is because within your data fields, you will also need to start referencing some data types. So that just means that we're going to have to create all our data types first and then build out the fields that lie within them. And so the different data types I have, the first one is restaurant. I will create that. Then there was orders. And then the last data type I will add is called food. Items. I'll create that. And now back in my Notion doc, I can start to add in all of the necessary data fields that lie within each data type. So we'll start with our user data type here. In this case, I'm just going to be storing a name, a profile photo, and an account type. This is all fairly straightforward. So I'll jump into Bubble here, select to open up our user data type, and then I will create a new data field, which will be called name. So this is obviously just the name of the user. And I'll be storing this value when we register their account. This will just be a standard text field. I'll choose to create that. Then I would like to register the profile photo for a user. And this, of course, will be an image data field. I'll create that. And then finally, there'll be a field called account type. And now this field will be helpful within our build to help us differentiate between those users who are registered as consumers within our application. So people who are just looking to purchase and order food. And then also those users who are registered as delivery drivers. Because based on the account type that a user creates, we can create different in-app experiences to suit their own custom needs. I'll be explaining this in more detail when we get to that within our build, but I'm going to start by just adding this as a text field type, and then I'll choose to create that. And that's all the data fields I'll need to add under our user data type there. If I jump back into Notion, I can highlight those and check those off. The next thing I'll be adding is all the data fields under our restaurant. So if I jump over into Bubble, open up our restaurant data type, I can start by adding in the name of the restaurant. Very much the same as our user data type. This will just be a text field. I'll create that. Then there was the logo of the restaurant. This will be an image field. I will create that. And then below this, I would like to register the suburb of the restaurant. This will just be a text field. And now in a moment, I'll also be explaining how we will register the address of this restaurant. But the reason I just want to register a suburb as a text field is because I'd also like to include the suburb name within the restaurant's name. And I can join both of these text data fields together when I actually display a restaurant on our homepage. But for now, I'm just going to create that. Then I will need to register a featured image for this restaurant. So this will be the hero image that displays on their own restaurant profile page. This, of course, will just be another image field type. I'll create that. Then I would like to register the specific address for this restaurant. And this will be a geographic address, which thankfully in Bubble integrates with Google Maps. So you can pull and store a valid real-world address within this data field. I will create that. And now I would like to register a list of all the food categories that will be relevant to this restaurant. And this is where I will start to begin to reference our list of option sets. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this field categories. And for this field type, I would like to reference our food categories option set here. And because a restaurant can serve more than one particular food category, I'm going to select that this is a list with multiple entries, which just means that they can store multiple food categories based on the type of food that they serve. I'll choose to create that. And now I would also like to add another field, which will just be the description of the restaurant. So this will just be like a bio or an overview of this restaurant. This will just be another standard text field. And then finally, the last field will just be what's called the published status of a restaurant. So essentially, the reason why I'm adding this is because from the time that a restaurant is created and then the restaurant owner actually updates the information stored within this restaurant, I won't actually want that restaurant to be displayed within our homepage because its profile wouldn't yet be complete. And so what I'm going to do is select that this published status would be a yes or no type, meaning the restaurant is published and ready to be viewed, or it isn't published and ready to be viewed. And I'm going to select to create this, and then beside this field here, I'm going to update the default value of this to be no, So that way by default restaurants are not published, and later on we'll be creating a workflow that recognizes once the necessary information for this restaurant has been added, it will then change this status to be yes, which means of course that restaurant could then be displayed within our homepage. But that is all of the data fields I'll need to add for our restaurant data type here. So I'm going to highlight all those, check those off, and then I'd like to add the data fields for our food items. So essentially every restaurant within our application will be able to create a list of food items that they can sell. So I'm going to go and add all of these necessary data fields within those. We'll start by heading over to our food items data type here. And then I would like to just add a name for this food item, which will just be a text data field. Then of course I'd like to register an image for this food item. And this will also be an image field type. Then I will need to add a description for this food item, which again will just be a text field type. And now I would also like to add the price of this food item, which will need to just be a number. I will create that. And then finally I'd like to link this food item back to a restaurant that it belongs to. And the way I can do this is by creating a new field, and I'll be calling this OG restaurant. So this will be the original restaurant that this food item belongs to. And this field type here will need to be a restaurant type, which of course is our separate data type. And this is what I love about Bubble's custom database feature, is that it allows you to create a truly relational database experience all within a visual editor. I'll choose to create that. And then that is all the fields I'll need to add for my food items data type. I'll jump back into Notion, highlight all of these, and then tick those off. And then finally, the last data fields I'll need to add is just under my order data type. So essentially, whenever an order is placed within my application, I would like to just register some fields identifying what the food item is, what the restaurant is that it belongs to, and then also keep track of the actual status of the order. So I'll need to know if it's currently being cooked and in process. I'll need to know if it's en route to being delivered and so on. And so that's the style of data fields I'll be adding into this data type here. But I'll explain these in more detail as I walk through them. So let's jump into our Bubble editor here and open up our order data type. The first field I'd like to register is the restaurant that this order belongs to. Because once an order has been placed, I'd like to show that restaurant owner what that order is. So the field type here will of course be a restaurant, because I'll be storing the value of an existing restaurant in our application. I'll create that. Then within this order, I would also like to register who the customer is. So I'll type in the word customer, and because the customer will be a user, so a consumer within our application, I will select that this will need to link to our user data type. I'll select to create that. And then while we're here, I'd also like to register who the delivery driver for this order will be, which of course will be another user. And as I mentioned when we were creating our user data type, we've also added a way to identify between the different account types within our application. So whether a user is a consumer or a delivery driver. So that just means that both of those types of accounts will of course be a user property, and I'll be referencing those within this data field as well. So I'll add this data field. I will call this delivery driver, and then this field type will be another user field type, which of course will link to our user data type. I will create that. And now within this order, I'd also like to identify the list of total food items that will need to be prepared. So I'll create a new field, and I'll be calling this field food items. And this will be our food items data type. And now because a user can order multiple food items within one particular order, I'm going to need to select that this is a list with multiple entries. I'll create that. I'd also recommend, if you're a little confused, to just update the name of our food items data type here. I'm just going to remove the plural off that, just to clarify that within every data field here, this will just link to one particular food item. And then within our order, we of course will be storing a list of multiple food items. But once I've added in that data field, I'd like to create another and call this field total price. So this will be the total price of all the food items in aggregate together for this order. And this field type will once again just be a number because we'll be working with a currency here. I will create that. And then what I'd also like to do is create a field to identify the drop-off location for this particular order. So the pickup location for our order, because we're integrating it with a restaurant here, we can easily pull the address associated with our restaurant data type here. But what I would also like to do is just create a data field that allows us to identify what the delivery address will be to the consumer's drop-off location. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this field drop-off location. And this field type will be another geographic address. I'll create that. And now the last data fields I'd like to add under our order data type is just a way to register the current status of this order. And I'll be explaining this as I add them in. So the first field I'd like to add is the in progress status of this order. And this will be a yes or no field type. And what I mean by in progress is that when a restaurant owner sees this order come in, they can select that they've started to cook or prepare this food. So they would mark the in progress status of this order from no over to yes. So I will create this field and I will set the default value of this to be no, because by default a food item wouldn't automatically be cooked. It'll instead have to wait until the restaurant owner updates that value. The next field I would like to add is what's called searching for driver. And this field will allow us to identify once an order has been finished in progress. A restaurant owner can mark that as complete, and then our application will begin searching for a driver for this order. And this field type will of course be another yes or no field type, because a order within our application will be searching for a driver or it won't be searching for a driver. So I'll choose to create that. And by default, I'm going to need to update the value of this to be no, because we'll only want to search for a driver once the in progress status has been updated to yes. Then the next field I'd like to create is what's called en route. So this would just be another yes/no field type that recognizes when the searching for driver status has been found. I would like to update the en route status to be yes from no. So that just means that a delivery driver is on their way delivering the food item to the user who purchased it. I will create this, and once again, by default, I'll be updating this value to be no. And then finally, the last data field I'd like to add is called delivered. And this is obviously what it sounds like. This just identifies if the order has been delivered or not. So I'm going to select once again that this is a yes or no field. I will create this and select that the default value should be no. And within a workflow later on in our build, I'll be explaining how we can update the delivered status to yes once a delivery driver selects that they have actually delivered this order. But that is all of the data fields I'll need to add under our order here. I apologize if this sounds a little confusing now. I will definitely be explaining these in as much detail as possible when we reach this stage of our tutorial. But for now, I just wanted to take the time to explain how we could build our own custom database using Bubble's visual tool. Back in my Notion doc here, I'm just going to highlight that I've finished adding in all of the data fields for my order data type. And just like that, we've finished creating our own custom database for our Uber Eats clone app. What I'd like to then do is actually build out the restaurant dashboard page within our application. And on this page, it will allow a restaurant owner to update any information for that restaurant, as well as add any food items that they would like to list for that restaurant. Essentially, this is just like a settings page for a specific restaurant. And this, of course, is necessary before we go and build out an actual homepage to display a list of restaurants, because, of course, we'll need to update the information stored within those restaurants. Let's jump on over into our Bubble editor, and I'll show you how we can get started. And on this page, like I've always done so far, I'm just going to reduce the actual size of it so it looks like a mobile device. I'm going to then stretch that down as well, and also update the background color of it to just be a light shade of gray. One thing I will also note is by this point, the type of content for this page should be set as a restaurant. This will just allow us to dynamically display any information of a restaurant that has been sent through to this page. But from here, as I mentioned, the actual design of this page will be much the same as our user settings page, only this time we'll be displaying the information and data fields of a restaurant. So let's start by adding in a text element onto our page. And what I'll be doing here is just displaying the name of the restaurant itself. So I'll choose to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current page restaurant. So the current page restaurant is the restaurant that we're viewing on this page. So let's say we've sent through the value of a restaurant through to this page, we can now display any information of that restaurant. And in this case, I'd like to display its name. What I'd also like to do is then just display the suburb of this restaurant. So there might be some cases where a user has a franchise. And so just by displaying the name of the suburb that this restaurant is within, will just help them differentiate between what restaurant is what when they're managing and making changes to them. So after I've added in the current page restaurant's name, I'm going to just select on the next line here, I'll add a space, and then I'll add an open bracket. And then within this, I'd like to display the current page restaurant's suburb. So I'll insert dynamic data once again, and choose to display the current page restaurant's suburb. And then on the next line, I will just close that bracket, and when I click away, it will move that up accordingly. What I'd also like to do is just update the style of this to be a H2 style heading. I'll close that off there and just expand that out, and of course just center that horizontally in my page. And now the rest of the actual layout of this page will replicate much the same user interface as our user settings page. I'm going to start by copying this heading, I'll drag this down, and then below each heading I'll be adding in an input form which will display some initial content of a restaurant, and then of course will allow a user who manages this restaurant to update any of the data stored within that. So for this heading here, I'm just going to backspace all of the dynamic data I've added in, and then I will be updating this heading to display restaurant name. And I will leave this as a H2 heading. I will then close off the width of that text element. And then below this, I'm going to add in an input form here. I'll drag this out. And then I can just move my heading across so it's in line with the flat top of my input field there. And I'll be updating the name of this input field to be called restaurant name. And I'll be leaving this as a text content format. I could also just make that a tad bit bigger as well. And now below this, what I'd like to do is just copy our title, copy the input form, and drag that down. I'll just make sure that that is in line with the input field, and that is in line with our heading. And now I would like to update this text to display the word suburb. And then I will also be updating the name of this new input field to be called input suburb. And of course, once this field has been updated, it will also update the dynamic text displayed in our page heading there. And now below this, I'd like to actually store the geographic address for this restaurant. And in order to do this, I won't be using an input field. Instead, I'm going to be using a search box. And I'll explain how to use this in a moment, but first I'm going to just copy this heading here, drag this down, and I'll be updating this to display the word address. And now under my input forms here, as I mentioned, I'm not going to be adding in an input. Instead, I'm going to be adding in a search box. And now the reason I'm adding in a search box here is because Bubble allows you to update the style of information that you can search through. So essentially, search boxes allow you to search through either your whole database, or in this case, they can integrate with Google Maps and search through a list of valid addresses. And once a user starts typing in an address, it will automatically display a list of relevant options that they can choose from. So it just ensures that the formatting of that address is correct according to any Google Maps listings. Now once I've added that in, I'm going to update the name of this to be called search box address. And then I'm also just going to quickly edit the style of this search box here. And in this case, the only change I'd like to make is just the roundness of its border. I'm going to select that this should be 20, just so it matches the same formatting as the rest of my input fields on our page. I'll also just make that a tad bigger, and then move that across so it's in line with the rest of our input fields. Also expand that out, and just move that up on our page. There we go. And now below this, I'd like to display a list of categories that this restaurant owner can choose from. So once again, I'll be copying the heading here. I'll drag this down and I'll update this heading to display the word categories. Now these categories will be used on our home page to display a list of relevant restaurants based on, of course, the food category that they sit within. So this can be things like sushi, Mexican, burgers, Asian, whatever you'd like to filter options by within your application. Now, in order to display categories, I'm going to use a bubble plugin here to allow us to select from multiple categories. So of course, I could use a drop-down element and display a list of categories if I'd like, but one thing you might notice with a drop-down menu is that you can only select one option, whereas a restaurant might be able to cater for multiple different categories. It might be a Mexican restaurant that serves burgers, or it could be an Asian restaurant that serves some other different type of food. So in order to do this, I'm going to select from our plugins menu here. It's just under my screen recorder, but if I open up my plugins menu, select to open up the plugins library, I'm just going to search for the word multi. And I'm going to then select from the multi-select drop-down, which is a free plugin from Bubble here. I'll click to install that. And then I will select to close this. I'll jump back into my design tab here. And now if I scroll on down under my input forms here, you'll see that we have an option to select from the multi drop-down option. I'm going to add this element in. And now once I've added in my multi-selector input field here, I'm going to need to update the choices style that I actually display here. So similar to a drop-down menu, you can choose to display a list of static options, or if you'd like, you can choose to display a list of dynamic choices. And this could be any values that are stored within your database, in which case I will be doing today because I'd like to display a list of categories stored within our option sets list. So I'm going to select that the choices style here should be dynamic choices. And then what I'll need to do is update the type of choices that I'll be displaying here. And in this case, it will be our food categories option set that we had previously added when we were configuring our database. And then what I'll need to do is identify what specific food categories I'd like to display from that list. In this case, it will be all the food categories. And then from here, I just need to select what the caption will be for all of the choices that are displayed. In this case, I'd like to just display the current option, so all of my food categories from my option set. It's display, which is just the text that we had given as the name of that food category. Then what I'll do is just scroll on down to the styling of this element. I'm just going to update the roundness here of our border to be 20, so it also matches the same style as our other input fields. I'm then just going to make sure this is in line with the rest of my input fields, and then I'll just move that up a tad on our page as well. Perfect. I might also just quickly expand the height of that so it looks much the same as the rest of our input fields as well. And so now below our multi drop-down menu here, I'm going to copy the heading, bring this down, and in this case, the next input will display the description for this restaurant. So once again, if I scroll on over to my input forms here, I'm not going to select just a regular input. I'm going to select a multi-line input instead. And now the difference between a regular input that we've used before and a multi-line input is that, as the name mentions, this input allows a user to add in as much text as they would like, and it will continually expand downwards. If you were to just use a regular input like this one, and then a user was to add in more text, it would continually just move across and focus on that text at hand, which means it would cut out any initial text that you have at the start of your input field. Whereas with a multi-line input field, it will just continually expand downwards, as I mentioned. I'm going to update the name of this to be called multi-line input field description. And then I will also update the roundness of the border again. So I'm going to scroll on down under the style here. Next to our border, I'm going to select that this should be a 20. I'll then make sure this is in line with the rest of our input fields, and just increase the height of that field. I'll also just move this up a tad as well. Perfect. And now the last two fields I'd like to register for this restaurant is the logo and the featured image we'll be displaying for it. So I'm just going to copy this heading, drag it down once again. I'll be updating this to display the word logo. I'll then close the actual element width, and then I will copy this heading again, drag this one across, and this will display featured image. I'll need to make sure that's in line with our other heading as well. And now below both of these headings, I'm going to need to select from my input forms, and I'll choose to add in a picture uploader. The first one will just be a square because the logo will just be a square logo, nice and simple. I'll update the name of this element to be called picture uploader logo. I might also just make that a tad bit bigger and a little bit higher. I'll also just make sure that's in line with the rest of my input fields there. And now I can just copy this picture uploader element. And in this case, I'm just going to drag this out horizontally so the width is longer. I can then move the heading across there. And in this case, I'm just going to update the name of this picture uploader to be called picture uploader featured image. And now, of course, I can add in a button element similar to our user settings page that just allows the user who's managing this restaurant to click this and update all of the data stored within our database for this specific restaurant. So I'll be updating the name of this button to display the word update. And what I would like to do is choose to start edit a workflow whenever this button is clicked. And within this workflow, I'll be selecting from our data tab, and this will be the exact same as our user account settings workflow that we had created. So I'll select to make changes to a thing. In this case, the thing I'll be making changes to is the current page restaurant, so the restaurant that we're currently viewing. And then what I'll need to do is just update any of the fields stored for this restaurant with the corresponding value of the data field on our page. So I'll start by selecting the address. This will need to be the value of our search box address. And then there will be our categories. And in this case, what I'd like to do is add a list of categories. So any options that are selected from our multi-select input, I would like to add all of those to the categories for this restaurant. So I'm going to select here to add a list of categories because a user can select from multiple categories, if you remember. I will then select that we're adding the list of options from our multi drop-down, its value. Then I would like to select that the description will equal the value of our multi-line input description. Then there was our featured image, which of course will be the value of our picture uploader featured image. Then there was the logo, which was the value of our picture uploader logo. Now below this, there was the name of the restaurant, which is the value of our first input field. So input restaurant name. I will add another field here. And in this case, I'm just going to quickly skip the publish status and explain that next. But I'll just be selecting from the suburb. This will be the value of the input suburb. And then finally, what I'd like to do is update the publish status of this restaurant to now equal yes. So essentially, by default, the publish status was set to no within our database for every restaurant that we had created. And the reason I did that is because from the time where a user actually creates a restaurant under their user settings page, if you remember, and then they move on to actually updating all the information stored within their restaurant dashboard here, I obviously wouldn't want that restaurant to be displayed on our homepage for users looking to order food. But now because the restaurant manager has actually added information to this restaurant, I will be updating that publish status to yes. And then I'll be showing you later on our homepage, I'll only be displaying restaurants where the publish status is also yes. So any restaurant that the owner has taken the time to fill out all of the necessary information for. But of course, I'll be explaining that in more detail when we get to that module. In the meantime, there's one additional step I'd like to add to this workflow here, and that is just display a success alert message again, similar to our user settings page. So I'll be selecting from our design tab here. I'll choose to add in an alert. I'll just drag this out anywhere on my page. And I will update the text of this to display the word updated. And then I will tick that this should be positioned at the top of our page. And then what I will do is jump back into our workflow editor and add an additional step into our workflow and display that success alert. So if you remember, this event was under our element actions here. I'll choose the show message option, and by default that is the only alert on our page, so it will automatically select from that. And now of course I'm going to jump back into my design tab here, and similar to my settings page for our user accounts, I'm going to need to also display some initial content within every input field here. So because the manager of this restaurant has updated the information, I'd like to now make that visible to them so we can store that correctly within our database. So I'll select that the initial content here for our restaurant name will need to be the current page restaurant's name. Then there was the suburb. This will be the current page restaurant's suburb. Then for our address, the default value here will need to be the current page restaurant's address, which of course was a location. Then for our categories, the default value again will need to be the current page restaurant's food categories, so just categories there. The description will be the initial content. This will be the current page restaurant's description. I apologize if I'm running through these pretty quickly, but obviously you'll just need to match the field within your database with the relevant field on the page. Then there was our logo. The dynamic image will be the current page restaurant's logo. And then the featured image, the dynamic image, will be the current page restaurant's featured image. And now once we've finished building out the feature to update the information of this restaurant itself, I'd like to create a feature that allows us to start adding food items to this restaurant's listing. And the way I'll be doing this is by utilizing a pop-up element on our page. But the first thing I'll be doing is actually just moving this button down a tad, making it a little bit bigger. And then I would like to copy this button, drag this across, make it in line with the edge of our inputs on the right hand side of our page. And from here I'll be updating the name of this button to display add menu item. And now every time this button is selected, I would like to display a pop-up element that allows the restaurant owner to start adding in a food item. So if I scroll on down here to my containers menu, I can see I have an option to add in a pop-up. And now essentially if you haven't used a pop-up before, they just allow you to display information on your page without having to redirect the user through to another page. So as you can see here, the bubble editor will just set the focus on the pop-up, and you can choose to display any information on that you would like. And then when a user closes that pop-up, it will take them back to the page that they were currently on. And of course, after you've closed your pop-up in the editor, you can view it by selecting under the elements tree to open up that pop-up once again. In this case today, I'm just going to be updating the name of our pop-up to be called add menu item, just so I can reference it within any workflows. I won't need to add a type of content or a data source to this pop-up, as I won't be displaying any dynamic information yet. We definitely will be later on in our tutorial, but I'll explain that in more detail when we get there. For this pop-up though, I'm just going to be keeping things pretty straightforward, and I'm just going to be adding some input fields that a user will need to include when they create a new food item. So this will just be things like the name of the food item, the photo for it, and the price for it. So I'm going to select by adding in a text element onto this pop-up, and I'll be calling this name. I'll update this to be a H2 style heading. I'll just close off the actual width of that. And then very much the same as our settings pages, I'll be adding in an input field here to this pop-up, and I'll be calling this input field food name. I can then also, if I'd like, just move that across so the heading is in line with the flat surface of our input field. Make that a tad bigger there as well. And after the restaurant manager has added a name for this food item, I'm going to copy this heading, drag it down once again. And in this case, I'd like to update the heading to display the word description. And because I'm adding in a description, I'm just going to quickly drag that heading out. What I'll need to do is select from our multi-line input field again, because this description can obviously be longer than one line of text. Once I've added that multi-line input field in, I'll update the name to just display description. And then what I'd like to do is scroll on down to our border and make that a 20 roundness, just so it looks the same as our previous input form. I'll also just drag that out so it's the same width as our input and make that a tad smaller as well. And now from here, I am going to copy both the title and the actual input field itself here. I'm going to drag these down below. I will first move just the title in line with the rest of our titles, and then follow with the input field. And I'm going to reduce the actual size of the input field here, because this will just display the price of this food item. So I'm going to update the title to display the word price. And I would also like to update the name of this input field to display the word price. And because I'm displaying a currency within this input field, I'm going to need to update the content format of it. So this will need to display from a currency, which will register that with a currency prefix and also store that as a number within our database. And then finally, the last field I'll need to add is just the image for this food item. So I'm just going to copy this heading here, drag this across, make sure it's parallel with our other heading, and I'll just be updating the name of this to be called featured photo. I'm going to need to drag that out, and then I'll be adding in just a picture upload element below this. So I'll drag that down, make it relatively square. I'll just make sure this is also in line with the other input field there, and I'll update the name here to be called photo. I might make that a little bit more square as well. And from here, I'm going to need to just add in a button, which of course will trigger a workflow and create a food item with all of this new information that the restaurant manager has added. So I'm going to expand my pop-up there. I'll scroll on up to the button element. I'll add this in, and I'll update this to display add menu item. I'm just going to expand that up and out a tad as well. I will then center that horizontally within my pop-up. And now what I can do is create a workflow when this button is clicked. And I'll be creating a new thing within my database and storing all of the information of these input fields for this new food item. So I'll select to start edit a workflow here. And as I just mentioned, I'll be choosing to create a thing because a food item doesn't yet exist. So if I head to my data tab here, I can choose to create a new thing. The thing I would like to create is a food item. And now much the same as when we created a user account or a new restaurant, I'm just going to match the data fields stored in our database with the corresponding fields on our page. So in this case, I'm going to start by just going through the list here. So the description for this food item will be the same value as the multi-line input description. I'll add another field. I'll choose that the image for this food item will be the picture uploaders value. Then there was, of course, the name of this food item, which will be the input food name. And then I'm just going to skip the restaurant there, but I'll add in the price of this. We'll need to equal the value of the input price, which was, of course, a currency. And then finally, the last field I'll need to add is the original restaurant that this food item will belong to. So because I'm splitting our food items as a different data type from our restaurants, I'm going to need to link this food item back to a restaurant. And of course, in this case, the restaurant that this food item will belong to is the value of the current page restaurant that the user is currently managing. And that is all we'll need to add for this step of our workflow. Within the actual workflow itself, though, I'm going to need to add a few additional steps. The first that I would like to add is the option to reset the values of the inputs. So let's say, theoretically, a restaurant manager has come to this page, they've selected to add a new menu item, they've added in all the details of the first item on their menu, they select to add that, it creates that in our database and links that to their restaurant. What I'd like to do is create an experience that closes this pop-up, and then of course the restaurant manager might like to also add a second item of food to this restaurant. So in that case, they would click this button again, and the pop-up would then need to display once again. But as it stands, the values of the first food item will still be stored within all of our input fields here. So what we'll need to do is just add a step in our workflow that actually resets all of these input fields. So that way the restaurant owner doesn't have to refresh the whole page to add in another food item. And this will make a lot more sense when I show you a preview of the actual application experience itself. But for now, we'll just jump back over into our workflow editor here. And after a food item has been created, I'm going to select to add an additional action. And I'm going to scroll on down to our element actions here. And I'm going to choose from the reset inputs option. And that will just now reset all of the inputs on our pop-up element. And then finally, the last step in our workflow I'd like to add is just an action that actually closes that pop-up. So I'll select from our element actions, and then up in the top right hand corner here, I'm going to select from the hide option. So this will just hide an element on our page. And in this case, the element I'd like to hide is the pop-up that I've just created. And now, of course, because we're hiding that element, we'll also need to remember to create a workflow to show this element. So if I just close that pop-up, I will now need to create a workflow when the add menu item button is selected here. And in that case, I just like to choose to show the pop-up we've just created. So I'll select to start edit a workflow. And then this is a pretty straightforward workflow to create. I'm just going to select from our element actions here. And then in the top left-hand corner, I'll be selecting the show an element option. And the element will of course be our pop-up once again. And that is all we'll need to create for our pop-up experience there. Before I jump ahead and show you a preview of this whole experience for our restaurant dashboard, there is two last elements I'd like to add to the bottom of our page here, and that is just two additional buttons. So in order to do this, I'm going to need to expand the height of our page, and I'm just going to copy this button here, our first update button. And in this case, what I'd like to do is update the text of this button to display the word view orders, because essentially within our application, I'm also going to be creating a page where restaurant owners can view a list of all of the incoming orders that have been made for food items within their own restaurant. And that dashboard will be used to allow restaurant owners to track any orders and of course the status of those orders. And so within this button, what I'd like to do is just create a redirect through to another page within our application. And that page will just be a order dashboard where the restaurant owner can view a list of all the orders for any restaurants that they own. And so before I create this workflow, what I'd like to do is actually create that page because I'll be storing a content type value on it. So if I select from our page drop down here, I'm going to choose to add a new page, and I'll be calling this page order dashboard. I'll choose to create that. And now on this page, the only thing I'll need to do right now is just update the type of content here to be a restaurant, because essentially what I'd like to do is display a repeating group of this page of any orders where the restaurant that the food has been ordered from matches the value as a restaurant that's been sent through to this page, which means that back on my manage a restaurant page here, I can scroll on down to our view orders button. I'll choose to start edit a workflow, and within this workflow I'd like to create a redirect through to our new order dashboard page and send through with it the value of the current page restaurant that the restaurant manager is editing. So if I select from our navigation option here, I'll choose the go to page option. I'll select the destination page to be our order dashboard. And the data I'll be sending through to this page is of course the current page restaurant. And now after we've created this workflow, there's one last button I'd like to add. So I'm just going to copy this button here, drag this across, make sure it's in line with both of the other buttons there. And for this button, I'm just going to update the text to display the words view listing. And you probably guessed it by now, but this button is going to redirect the restaurant owner through to the page where they can actually view the active restaurant listing, which of course is the same page that our users will be looking at whenever they want to purchase any food items from this restaurant. And so once again, what I'm going to need to do is first create that page within our application. So I'll select from our page drop down menu on the left. I'll choose to add a page. And I'll be calling this page restaurant. I'll choose to create that. And then the only thing I'll be doing once again is just updating the type of content of this page to be a restaurant, because I'll be of course displaying all of the information of any restaurant that's been sent through to this page. And then from here I'm going to jump back into Manage Restaurant Portal. I will select our View Listing button and I'll choose to start edit a workflow. And then within this workflow I'll choose a navigation event. Once again, I'll be selecting the Go to Page option. The destination page will now be our restaurant page. And the data I'll be sending through, as you would imagine, is the current page restaurant. And that is the very last feature I'll be adding to this page. I know that this module was quite long, and that's just because this is essentially the framework we'll be building to be able to not only update the details of a restaurant, but of course be able to manage what food items are displayed on that restaurant, as well as allow anyone who's managing a restaurant to view a list of all their orders and then view the actual listing of that restaurant itself. So this was definitely an essential portal that we needed to create in order to power the rest of our application that I'll be covering in more detail later on. The next feature we'll be focusing on in our build is the process of creating a home page where we can display a list of all of the relevant restaurants that a user would like to search for. And that of course will include being able to build out a custom search functionality so we can display a list of relevant results. This is a fairly straightforward process, but there are a few specific little details along the way. So let's jump into our bubble editor and I'll walk you through this process. And now at this point, the homepage itself should be blank and there should be anything on it. And there also shouldn't be a type of content stored on this page. That should also be empty. What I'd like to do from here is just reduce the total size of this page. I will expand that out. And then like I always do, I'll just be updating the background color to be a light shade of gray, which will just allow me to see where any inputs lie in regards to the borders of my page. Now the first thing I'll be doing on this page is selecting to add in a text heading at the top. And the text here will just display the word restaurants. I will update this to be a H2 style heading. And then I will just reduce the total size of that element. And I will choose to center that horizontally in our page. And now the first thing I'll be adding to our home page is just a repeating group element here, which will be used to display a list of all of the relevant restaurants that a user might be interested in. And so in order to display a list of restaurants stored within my database, I'd like to update the type of content of this repeating group to search and display for restaurants. And then I'd like the data source to perform a search through our database. So I'll just be selecting the Do a Search For option. And then I'd like to search for all of the restaurants within our database. And now I can choose to add in some constraints to refine which specific restaurants I would like to display. In this case, what I'd like to do is only display the restaurants where the actual physical location of these restaurants, so where the address is within, and I'd like to only display restaurants where the address is within a 10-kilometer radius of the current user's location. So what I can do here is just type in when the address is within 10, I'll choose from the kilometers option here. And then I will need to select from the current user's location. So I can scroll on down and there's a predefined field here that we can use called the current geographic position, which will be registered from the current user's account. And I'd like to format that as an address. So now only those restaurants within 10 kilometers of the current user's location will be displayed within our homepage. And now the reason I'm not storing an address field within our database and then only displaying the restaurants within 10 kilometers of the user's stored address in our database is because there might be some instances where the user themselves won't always be ordering food from their own home location. They could be at a party or a friend's house and they might like to order some food from that location. So I'd always just like to pull in the current geographic address formatted as an address for the current user at the time. The only other constraint I'd like to add within this repeating group is just displaying the restaurants where the published status equals yes. And the reason I'll be doing that is that will allow us to filter out any restaurants where the details haven't been correctly updated for that listing. And so that way users will only be able to see a list of valid restaurants on their homepage. Once I've configured the data source of our repeating group, I can choose to close that. And then I can update the layout style here to be extended vertical scrolling, which just means that it will display a full list of all the relevant items within our database. And then I can update the number of rows to just be 2 here. And now within our repeating group, I'm going to start adding in some dynamic elements that I'd like to display. The first will be an image, which will be the featured image for the restaurant. So once I've added the image element into our repeating group, I'll need to insert some dynamic data. And in this case, as I just mentioned, I'd like to display the featured image for the restaurant within each cell. So I'll select to display the current cell's restaurants, featured image. I can then just move that up to the top of my repeating group and expand that out. And then just center that horizontally in my repeating group. And now below this, what I'd like to do is just add in the title, which will be the name of the restaurant itself. So I'll choose to insert dynamic data. And once again, I'd like to display the current cell's restaurants. In this case though, I'll be displaying its name. I can then just move the text element in line with my image, drag that out so it's the same width as my image. And then I'm also just going to bold this text here for that heading. So in order to do this, I can just select to open up our rich text editor here. I can highlight all that text and just select to bold it. I'll save that. And now you'll see that formatting has been added to that text. And now once I've displayed a list of all of the relevant restaurants based on their location and their published status, what I will do is create a workflow when the image of this restaurant is clicked. And in that case, what I'd like to do is redirect the user through to a restaurant page where they can view the full information of that restaurant, as well as any food items that have been added to that restaurant. So in this case, I'm going to select the Start Edit Workflow button when this image is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm going to create just a redirect event. So I'll be selecting from our navigation option here, and I'll be choosing the Go to Page option. The destination page here will need to be the restaurant page, which if I just jump over to there, I just want to clarify that at this point in our tutorial, this page will be blank. I've just called it the restaurant page, and the type of content will need to be set to a restaurant because of course I'll be sending the data through of a restaurant to this page. If I then jump back into my home page, open up my workflow editor again, I will, as I mentioned, select the destination page to be the restaurant page, and the data I'd like to send through is the current sales restaurant. And that is all I'd like to build out for this particular workflow here. If I jump back over to my design tab, there is one last feature I would like to add to our homepage, and that is the ability to create a custom search experience that allows users to search for restaurants within our application, and then be redirected through to that restaurant page if they decide to click that listing. This is a fairly straightforward process, so I'm going to start by moving our repeating group down on the page. And then I'm going to add in a search input element. So if I scroll on down on my left hand side here to my input forms, I can see there's an option to not just select a regular input form, but instead select to add a search box. And the difference between a search box and a regular input is that a search box allows you to reference any entries within your database and display a list of those as a user types in a search query. And I'll be showing you how we can link this search box to display a list of all the restaurants that we have created within our application today. But to get started, I'm going to update the placeholder text of this search box to just display what are you craving? ? And then I will also just move this down a tad on our page. And now what I'll need to do is configure what specific item within our database we'd like to search for. So in this case, I'm going to leave the choices style as a dynamic option. This just means that we can dynamically pull any values from within our own database. And then below this, I'm going to select to define a list of options. So in this case, I'd like to define what particular data type we'll be searching through within our database. And in this case, I'm going to obviously select to search through all the restaurants within our database. And from here, I'll need to add in a constraint to only display the restaurants where the published status equals yes. So these are the restaurants that should be displayed on our application. So I'll select to add a constraint and identify when the published status equals yes. And then I can close this data search there. And now I'll just need to identify what particular data field within our restaurant a user can search for. And in this case, I'd just like it to be the name of that restaurant. So let's say a user was typing in for a specific restaurant name, or even just a style of food, so it could be something like Mexican or burgers. If a restaurant has that keyword within its name, it will automatically display within our search box here. And all of those relevant results will display in a drop-down box below our search element here. And then what I also love about the search box is that you can also trigger workflows when an entry within it is clicked. So in this case, a user would come to a home page, they would search for a specific type of food or a specific restaurant, and then once they select an item, we can create a workflow off the back of that then redirects them through to the restaurant's individual page. So in order to do this, I'm going to select to open up my workflow tab here, and I'll choose to create a new workflow. The trigger for this workflow will be under our Elements tab here, and I'm going to need to select the option that identifies when an input's value is changed, and by default it will automatically pull in the search box element. And now from here, what I'd like to do is choose from our navigation option and select the Go to Page event. And in this case, I'd like the destination page to be our restaurant page. And the data I'd like to send through is the search box's value. So whatever the value of a restaurant the search box returns to a user when they type in a query, when they select that, it will then send the user through to that specific restaurant page. And that is all we'll need to add to power this workflow within our search experience today. And from here, I'm happy to go ahead and preview what our whole homepage experience looks like within our Bubble development environment. Over in my application here, I've gone ahead and just added in a few additional restaurants within my Uber Eats app. If you find for some reason that you're unable to see a list of restaurants on your homepage, I'd recommend just removing the location parameter within your data source for your repeating group, as that will obviously constrain what restaurants can be displayed based on your own current location. Just remember, you can always add that in at a later point in time. But from here, I can see that I have 2 restaurants listed on my homepage. But let's say I'd like to go and search for any restaurants where the word burger is in the heading. I can see that my search box has displayed a list of all the restaurants in my database where the search query is within the heading of our restaurant. And if I was to select to click through to my San Francisco Burgers restaurant, the workflow we had created would run. It would then send us through to our restaurant page, and as you can see in the URL string here, it's also sent through the value of that unique restaurant. Back in my Notion doc, I'm going to check off that I've finished building out our homepage, which of course allowed us to display a list of all of the restaurants within our application that were in the distance of a user's current location. And within that, I also explained how we could create our own custom search functionality that allowed us to search for a specific restaurant and then redirect a user through to that restaurant page. After building out our home page, we're going to move on to the next feature, which is just expanding the restaurant page that we had previously created, and start by adding all of the details of that restaurant on that dynamic page, as well as a list of all the food items that that restaurant has listed for sale. Let's jump on over into our Bubble editor and we can get started. Over on our restaurant page here, I'm going to start by closing the width of this page again so it looks like a mobile device. I'll expand that down, And then I'll also update the background color of this page to be the light shade of gray. And then I'd also just like to reiterate again that the type of content for this page at this point should be configured as a restaurant. And then from here, what I'd like to do is start adding in some dynamic elements onto this page to display the information of this restaurant. So I'll start by adding in a picture element here. So I'm going to select from the image. I'll drag this over the top of our page, so it's a hero image. And in this case, I'll just be displaying the featured image for this page's restaurant. So I'll select to insert dynamic data, and I'll choose to display the current page restaurant, so the restaurant that we're currently viewing when data's been sent through to it, its featured image. And now on top of this image, I would like to display the name of the restaurant. So I'm going to drag out a text element, again, just making sure it sits on top of my image here. Could move that down a tad. And I'd like to insert dynamic data that will display the current page restaurant's name. I'll also just update this to a H2 style font. And I'll just drag that down a tad so it's on the bottom of my image there. And once I've dragged that down, I would just like to note that I'm also going to be adding in the suburb information for this restaurant, which again can be useful for instances where restaurants are franchised, so things like McDonald's, because obviously you'd like to know which McDonald's in which suburb you're ordering from. So in order to display that, I'm going to select the line below my dynamic text. I'll add in a space. I'll add in an open bracket. And then I'll insert dynamic data and choose to display the current page restaurant's suburb. And then I'm going to select a new line. I'll add in a closed bracket. And when I click away, the bubble editor will validate that and join all of that text together. Now below this, I'm going to add in a text element. I'm going to drag this out on our page. And I'm going to make sure it's below my image. So I'm just going to move that down a tad. And from here, I'm going to select to insert dynamic data. And in this case, I would like to display the information of the restaurant's description. So I'll select to display the current page restaurant's description. I will close the height of that element, but drag it all the way across our page. Now, of course, if there's more text from a restaurant's description than one line, this will expand down vertically as well to suit and fit all of that in. And now I'm going to copy this heading again, drag that down. And in this case, I'd like to just display the address of this restaurant. So I'll choose to update the description field to now display the current page restaurant's address. And now below this, I would like to add in a repeating group element. I'll drag this out across our page. And within this repeating group, I'll be using this to display a list of all the food items that this restaurant has for sale. So I'll need to update the type of content to be a food item. And then I'll need to search through our database and display all of the food items where the OG restaurant, so the original restaurant that this food item is linked to within our database, when its value equals the current page restaurant, so the restaurant that we're currently viewing, I will then display that food item. And that is the only constraint I'll need to add for this repeating group. I will just update this to be extended vertical scrolling, and then also update the number of rows to be 2. And now within this, what I'd like to do is add in some dynamic text elements. So I'm going to start by dragging that in the top cell of my repeating group there. I'll insert dynamic data, and in this case, I'd like to display the current cell's food item, its name. I'll then just drag that over to the side and top left-hand corner of my repeating group cell. I can close off the height of that element as well. And I'm also just going to update the rich text editor formatting for this heading. I'm just going to highlight that and select to make it bold, just so it stands out a little bit more within our page. And then I'm going to copy this heading, drag this down. And then in this case, what I'd like to do is display the price of this current food item. So I'm going to backspace all of the dynamic text and the bold formatting of this text element. I'm going to add in a dollar symbol there. And then I'd like to insert dynamic data and display the current cell's food item, its price. And because that is stored as a number, that will now be formatted as a currency. I can then also just close off the width of that element because the dollar amount won't be very long. And then finally, within this repeating group cell, I'm going to add in an image. And this will be the featured image that is uploaded with this food item. So I'll be inserting dynamic data, and I'll display the current cell's food item, its image. Now if I move that up to the top of my repeating group, move it over to the right hand side, and I'll just make sure that it's not touching with my heading element there. Now I can also just move these down just a tad within my repeating group and close off the empty space here, just making sure there's still some space there so these aren't clustered on top of each other within our page. And now because we're only displaying a preview of this food item within our repeating group, I'm going to need to create a way to display the full information of this food item to the current user. Now this could include information like the description added to this food, or if you'd even like within your own application to store any information about the ingredients or the nutritional information about this, you can choose to display this on a pop-up element. So I'm going to be adding a pop-up element to this page. I'm going to scroll on down to our containers option here, add in a pop-up, and as I mentioned in the past, pop-ups are just a great way to display information without having to redirect a user from a page. And in this case, I'm going to be calling this pop-up food item because I'll be displaying a food item. And then I will also need to update the type of content to also be a food item. And that just means that I can send it data from a repeating group selection when a food item is clicked, and then open up this pop-up and send through the data of that food item and then display it accordingly on this pop-up. And now on this pop-up, I'm going to be replicating much the same experience as this page itself. I'm going to start by adding in another image element across the top of our pop-up here. And this will just display the featured image of the food item again. So I'll choose to insert dynamic data, and I will choose to display the parent group's food item. And now the parent group is the pop-up itself, which of course, as I just mentioned, is storing a type of content that's a food item. So I can now reference that food item's data fields at any given time. And in this case, I'd like to display the parent group's foods item, its image. And then I would like to, below this, add in a heading text element here. And I would like to display the parent group's foods item, its name. And then I'll also update the style of this to be a H2 style heading. I'll just make sure that's not touching with my actual image element. And I will reduce the size of the actual text there. And then from here, I'll be adding in another text element to this pop-up. I'll drag this across. And in this case, I'd like to just display the description of this food item. So I'll insert dynamic data and display the parent group's foods item, its description. I'll just drag that down, making sure it's in line with our other text element there. Drag that all the way across and just reduce the height of that element. Then finally, I would like to just copy this text element one last time, drag it down, and in this case, I'll be updating the description field to just display the price of this food. And then of course, I'll need to add a dollar symbol in front of this. And so a way I can do that is just by opening up the rich text editor, moving to select in front of the dynamic text, adding in a dollar symbol, and then selecting to save that. And then the last element I'll be adding to this pop-up is just a button element down the bottom. I will center that horizontally, move it down a tad, and I'll update the text to display add to order. And so that way in a later module, we can create a workflow that actually adds this food item to a user's current checkout. And now in order to display this pop-up itself, I'm going to first close this, and I'll need to create a workflow when the image of this food item is clicked, in which case I would like to send data to that pop-up and then display it. So if I select our image element here, I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, I'm going to scroll on down to the element actions here. And before I choose to show our pop-up, I'll need to select the display data option because I'll need to send some data through to this pop-up. So I'll select that the element I would like to send data to is the pop-up food item. And the data I'll be sending to it is the current cell's food item. So the food item that a user is selecting to view more information about. And then once we've sent data through to that pop-up, we can select from our element actions again and choose to show an element. And the element now will be the pop-up food item. And now that will send the relevant data through and display that pop-up accordingly. And that's all I want to cover right now about this page in our tutorial today. Of course, I will be covering soon in more detail the process of adding a food item to a checkout and then being able to process a payment to complete that purchase. But for now, let's just jump over into our Bubble development environment and preview what this restaurant page looks like. Over in my editor here, I'm currently viewing the restaurant page for my San Francisco Burgers restaurant. As you can see, I haven't worried too much about the actual design of this text element here, but because that's formatted in black, you just can't really see it against the contrasting image in the background. But what you will see is that it displays the name of the restaurant and the suburb that it's positioned within. It also displays the description and also the address of that restaurant. And I can see here I've added a food item into this restaurant, which is the Big Burger. If I would like to view more information about this, I can select the image for that. It will then send the value of that image through to our pop-up here and display all the information for that there. And as I mentioned, if you really wanted to take the time to display any additional information that you're storing within your database, you can definitely add that onto this pop-up element here. But this is all I'll be creating for this initial phase within our build today. Back in my Notion doc, I'm going to check off that I finished building out our restaurant page to display the dynamic information of an individual restaurant, which as well also allowed us to display a list of all the food items that belong to this restaurant. And of course, I also explained how we could view the full information of every food item by using a pop-up element. And that is all I have time for in this tutorial today. If you were interested in checking out the rest of the course, I'd recommend clicking the link in the description to purchase the full course. Within the complete course, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to complete the rest of our build. You can also get access to a suite of Bubble tutorials where you'll learn how to build other popular products. If you'd like to get started building some other popular products for free, I'll be sure to include some suggested links at the end of this video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see any other useful tutorials to help you on your Bubble journey.